Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight I'm going to be responding to a really well thought out contrarian idea to my video that I just did on Beyond the Castle Doctrine, the psychological need to protect yourself and what's yours. So I want to get straight into this because, like I said, this was a really good question, and I think that this will be very helpful to a lot of people who do have a different point of view. And like I said, I love it when somebody gives me another point of view and looking at something from a different perspective. So with that in mind, this is from Jack. So Jack, welcome, and thank you very much for your reply. You're doing a good job to unravel and explain this case. Thanks for trying to sort this out. The fact that the McCloskeys have been arrested and charged with a misuse of a firearm is the bottom line. Under Missouri law, 571.037, any person with a valid concealed carry permit and is lawful carrying a firearm in a concealed manner may briefly and openly display the firearm to ordinary sight of another person, unless the firearm is intentionally displayed in an angry or threatening manner, not in necessary self-defense. Did Mrs. McCloskeys briefly and openly display our firearm, or to use it for more than a brief period in an angry and threatening manner, not necessary in self-defense? Mrs. McCloskeys was pointing a gun at people walking by her house with a finger on the gun trigger. Under Missouri law, a person shall not use deadly force unless he or she reasonably believes such deadly force is necessary to protect himself or herself from a forcible felony. The Castle Doctrine does not allow you to shoot someone for trespassing because they're not a forcible felony. Hundreds of people walked past the McCloskey house in a span of several minutes, and they kept walking away from the McCloskey's house. People were not congregating in front of the McCloskey house or approaching it. The McCloskeys clearly were not the focus of the protest interest, despite the fact that the crowd was in motion and moving away. Miss McCloskey continued to indiscriminately use a gun to threaten every person as they walked by the sidewalk. Her action shows she didn't have specific and articulate facts to indicate any particular protester was going to commit a forcible felony. Instead, her actions were based on unreasonable prejudice, race-based fear or dislike. The McCloskeys may have also committed a hate crime under Missouri law. Now, Jack, again, I love your presentation and the idea that you brought out here. I have to say, though, I'm going to disagree with a number of things that you stated. And you rightfully point out that under Missouri law that a person cannot take a gun and point it at people in an indiscriminate manner. That's an absolute statement of fact. You're absolutely correct about that. But the issue here is that you said not necessary in self-defense. The question is, what were the McCloskeys' mindset? And I'm going to show you why I say their mindset is very important, at least from everything I understand about the law. Now, I will honestly say I'm not an attorney. I deal in psychotherapy, not in that. But in terms of reading people's minds and being able to see how people react, I would be able to, in a court of law, be able to say with certainty, well, let me rephrase that. I would be able to say that there are certain things that lend itself to looking a certain way or being a certain way based upon people's behavior. You can never say anything to a certainty. But the McCloskeys here, and in their behavior and in their mannerisms, were very much acting like people who thought they were in trouble. Number one, they did call the police themselves. And they reported what? They reported that they thought they were in danger. Number two, that when they are stating, and again, I don't know because I didn't hear, very specific things that were being threatened. Now, you're saying that the protesters were just peacefully walking along and leaving them alone and not saying anything to them. And that may or may not be true. I don't know if that evidence is, you can't tell from the videos that are out there what's being said and what's not being said. You could definitely see that there is some dialogue going on, both with Mrs. McCloskey and certain protesters. Because when she takes the gun and she's pointing, she'll see that her head swivels to other people that are talking. So it's not a matter that the protesters were just walking by, they were just leaving them alone, and all of a sudden she just started pointing guns at them. There is conversation going on back and forth. And you can see that very clearly in the video. So the issue of self-defense does fall into play here. And the question becomes, did they feel like they were in danger? And there's a couple of things that you said here that I do want to point out and play because they're important. So while you brought up that law and I went to go look it up, I came across something that I thought was very interesting. There's another attorney who was explaining in Missouri about certain gun laws that you have to be aware of and be careful of because you get yourself into trouble. And he mentions one of them. I think that you would agree is exactly what you're referring to. So when I found it, I said, great. And here it is.
Conceptions about gun laws. Number one, if you have to shoot someone on the front porch, drag the body inside. This is not a good idea. If you do have to shoot someone on the front porch, call the police, tell them you've been the victim of a crime, and wait for the police to arrive. Don't tell them anything else. When they do arrive, tell them that you want to speak with your lawyer before speaking with them. Number two, I can always shoot a dog that comes onto my property. That's not true. You can't shoot a dog on your property just because it's there. You can, in Missouri, use reasonable force against an animal. So if a dog is attacking you and you're in imminent danger of deadly harm, then you can use deadly force against that dog. Number three, a warning shot is the best way to scare off a trespasser. Warning shots are dangerous, and I don't recommend using them. You certainly don't want to take a warning shot at a trespasser. If you are in a situation where you believe that deadly force is about to be used against you, you can defend yourself.
I found this to be very interesting because it is in human nature to think that you want to do the least amount of damage in order to tell people to go away. So you would think a warning shot would be, okay, I'm serious, but that's actually not the recommendation, which explains a little bit about why some of these cases in Missouri happen the way they do.
However, if you're in that situation, you need to use your firearm. Do so, but only if you're justified. Number four.
I love how he says, but only if you're justified, as if you're supposed to know beforehand whether the justification is going to be seen by other people. Because this goes back to what we're going to talk about later, reasonableness, and what is considered reasonable.
If my gun isn't loaded, I can't be charged with a felony. That's simply not true. If you have an unloaded gun, you can still be charged with a felony. Say, for instance, you had a small amount of marijuana on you and you were also carrying a firearm. Unlawful use of a weapon, a felony charge. Let's say in another instance, you displayed your firearm in an angry and threatening manner even though it wasn't loaded. Again, subject to a felony criminal charge. It does.
And I think this is what you're referring to. This is the law that you can't use your gun in a threatening manner. And I would absolutely agree that that is exactly what happened. Now listen to the last thing he says on this matter, because this is where it's important.
It does not matter whether or not the gun is loaded. Number five, I can display my gun to scare someone away. In Missouri, it is a felony crime if you display your firearm in an angry or threatening manner. Now there are defenses to this charge, but if you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to display your firearm, call the police and call your Law Shield attorney. Again, if you display your firearm in an angry or threatening manner, you can be charged with unlawful use of a weapon.
And again, this is what you're referring to, right? You're displaying it in a threatening manner.
This is something I've seen a lot lately with the new permitless carry law. Many police departments are quick to write up charges for somebody based on unlawful use of a weapon, and these charges are often being prosecuted.
And I think this is exactly what you're referring to, that they have an unlawful use of the weapon because they displayed it. But you're going to find there's a difference between if they do that in public area or if they do that in a private or their home area. And this is why this is a very big difference.
Horrific story that happened over the weekend in St. Louis where these teenage boys, young teenage boys, left the house around midnight and started riding their bikes, came across a car, an unlocked car in somebody's backyard, started to rummage through the car. The 60-year-old man who owned the house heard something in the car, took out a gun, shot one of the boys dead, was arrested, has since been released. Now the community is asking the question, should he or should he not be charged with something? But then, of course, you have the Castle Doctrine, which says you are protected and you are allowed to shoot first and ask questions later if it's inside of your home. Greg Willard is our good friend, and he is the KTRS legal analyst, and he is a law professor at St. Louis University. Good morning, Greg Willard.
McCraw, good morning. How are you?
We're doing great. I know you've been paying attention to this story. What are your thoughts as you sit and you watch this? What does the Castle Doctrine actually say?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that this is a tragic event in all respects. And while there are legal overtones to us, I think you and I both agree that the more important item is the loss of this young man and the tragic circumstances. The Castle Doctrine in Missouri is especially expansive, McGraw. It stems from what we all remember from watching Perry Mason years ago, the self-defense defense. So for the crime in Missouri, it's illegal to take the life of another person. You have murder, you have voluntary manslaughter, and you have involuntary manslaughter. One of the defenses to that is the doctrine of self-defense, and within that doctrine is this notion that you are entitled to be protected and protect yourself within your residence. And that sort of the old English adage, a man's home is his castle. That's where the Castle Doctrine came from. It's part of the long-standing defense of self-defense to a charge such as this.
Okay, this wasn't in his home, but it was on his property. Does the property constitute, quote-unquote, your home?
Well, that's what I meant a moment ago, McGraw, by Missouri's expansive Castle Doctrine. Historically, and this goes back hundreds of years to Middle Ages England and certainly for decades and decades in Missouri, we had a self-defense defense. It required the person to reasonably believe that they were in fear of their imminent harm. The force had to be proportional, and they had a duty to retreat.
This is really, really imperative to understand this difference. So the law used to be those three factors, that the damage had to be proportional, that you're going to, if you're assuming the person's going to kill you, you had to be able to then be able to kill them at that point, because you could assume it could be proportionality, that you had a duty to retreat first, and the fact is that it was on the property of your home, inside your house. Now let's see how that was changed in the law and whether or not this is going to affect any of the things that you mentioned in your response.
So if there was someone breaking into your house, under the Castle Doctrine, you did not have to retreat. In 2007, and then again in 2010, the Missouri legislature significantly expanded the Castle Doctrine. It used to apply just to your residence. Now in Missouri, McGraw, what I guess we could call the Castle Doctrine, but this part of the defense applies to any, quote, private property that is owned by the individual claiming the justification.
Now this is imperative, because this goes back to the private property owned by the individual. And that gated community is considered to be private property owned by the individuals who are responsible for it. It's not a matter of just public property in a public arena. They're actually going to get through that in a little bit more detail. And that's why I'm stopping this. It's really important to understand that point and understand why it is that they're saying something's going on wrong here in lack of understanding of his doctrine. But this is, again, in 2015 when he's describing this. So this is way before this incident. But I just want you to understand here the nature of the event that was done was expanded greatly again in 2007 and in 2010.
End quote. So the Castle Doctrine in Missouri is no longer limited just to the actual four corners of your home, McGraw, but rather the Castle Doctrine in Missouri has been extended to include all of your property, number one, and number two, the element of proportionality of the response has been eliminated by the Missouri legislature.
Now that second part is very important also, because the nature of the threat, you don't need to say was proportional. So if I feel that there may be destruction to me or safety, I at that point now don't need to deal with the issue of proportionality.
In this day and age where we have seen police officers come under scrutiny for all sorts of things, if a police officer saw this boy rummaging around in a car and shot, the police don't have the same protections under the law that the homeowner has, it seems.
The police are held to a different standard.
This is huge. So you see that a police officer who would have done the same thing as this homeowner would not have been protected by the law the same way the homeowner was. And in this case, we're dealing with homeowners, which changes dramatically what they're legally allowed to do.
Under a different statute, and the criteria by which a police officer can use deadly force is set out in that statute. It is different from the homeowner. The homeowner in Missouri, or I should say the private property owner, since it's not just a homeowner, McCraw, it's private property.
Right.
You could think, for example, if this tragic incident the other evening took place out on a farm, and this young man was breaking into a car out in a farm field, several hundred yards away from the homeowner's home. The Castle Doctrine, as it is now written into the statute by the Missouri legislature, would arguably give that landowner the right to exercise deadly force against that intruder.
So here's a situation where the law, and again, whether you agree or disagree is not the point, is that had they fired on the crowd, they would have been able to have a defense based upon this doctrine, stating that they felt that their lives were in danger and they were using reasonable force in their minds to protect themselves and their family. Now, you could disagree and say, well, you didn't feel the protesters were a danger to them. And, you know, I'm sure there are going to be people that will agree. But I think there's going to be a lot of people agreeing, given the amount of people killed and given the amount of violence that took place, that seeing that type of protest there in a gated community where the gate was torn down, there was a reasonable fear that there could have been violence, even if none took place.
Now, let me add quickly, because I think it's important, that this goes hand in hand with a basic requirement. And that is that just because someone is on your land, you can't shoot them. The basic requirement in Missouri is twofold. The person using the force, let's say the landowner in this case, that person, number one, has to reasonably believe that the force he or she is about to use is necessary to defend themselves.
So, did the McCloskeys believe that exhibiting the guns in a pointing manner was reasonable in terms of defense, given what they perceived was the threat? That would be the first question. I think that the answer would have to be yes. Now, again, you could disagree and say you don't agree, but I think that more people, if you ask them, and if you had a jury of the peers, especially in Missouri, given what the laws are and how they've been expanded, I think that the answer, when a crowd of 200 to 300 people break into a gated community, that whether or not they would be fearful of that. And again, that's negating everything the McCloskeys said about threats being made and the fear of that they said they were going to do. And let's assuming none of that even happened. Just the nature of 200 to 300 people breaking down the gate is definitely enough for people to be able to feel fearful of what's going to happen, what are they willing to do. And given what was going on in Missouri at the time, with the protests and rioting and people dying and being killed, I think there is a reasonable fearfulness here.
And secondly, they reasonably believe that the perpetrator is about to use unlawful force.
Now again, they only have to believe that the perpetrator is going to use unlawful force. It does not mean that the perpetrator does use unlawful force. But when they broke through the gates and they were, again, going back and forth, and then you heard, watching her head swivel back and forth, talking to people and worrying about that. And she's pointing the gun at different people at different points in time. It wasn't just a matter of keeping it on one person, because the threat wasn't an individual. It was a group. At least that's what it looks like from the video of what they felt. And again, I will say, they were holding their weapons incredibly poorly. Very poor training for weapons that they have. They didn't seem to know what to do with those weapons. But the nature by which what they did with those weapons, basically where they were, sounds to me, and again from everything that I'm hearing, would be covered under this doctrine given the fact they were on their own house. Had they done this in public, had they done this in a public street, or on the sidewalk, or in a parking lot, or at a store, they would not be covered at all in this, and absolutely would be in violation. And you'd be 100% correct, that would be a felony. But they were not in a public area, they were on their private property.
So it's not that, well, just because you're on my land, I get a free pass to shoot you. Absolutely
Right.
not. But if you have reason to believe that you need to defend yourself, and you have reason to believe that that person is unlawfully on your property, well, then that gives rise to the very expansive castle doctrine that the Missouri legislature implemented in 2007 and 2010, McGraw.
Greg.
So given the fact they were there unlawfully, given the fact that they believed they were getting threats, given the fact they believed that things were going to go bad, that would actually give rise for them to be able to actually administer shooting the weapons. At least that's what he's saying. They didn't do that. They pointed as a deterrent.
Willard is the KTRS legal analyst. He's also a law professor at St. Louis University. He's also a great guy. Greg Willard, we're talking about this on a Wednesday morning at 9:15. The sun is shining, and it's a nice day, and we're not amped up. On a Saturday night, you're sleeping in your bed. You're aroused by some noise in your backyard. You see somebody rummaging around your car in your backyard. You don't know that they're 13. You don't know that they don't have a gun. It's dark outside. It's the middle of the night. So when we parse words like reasonably expected and reasonable force, reasonable to you and me on a Wednesday at 9:15 is very different than reasonable on a Saturday night at midnight.
And here is the crux of why the laws are horrific and where bias comes in. Because everything he just said is exactly the point. When we deal with reasonable to whom? Reasonable to what mindset? Because he's absolutely right. Where you are, how you see the world is going to change the way that you see reasonableness. I see what they did in terms of the threat as very reasonable. You do not think they did something that was reasonable. You felt the protest was so peaceful and these guys just coming out like maniacs putting out guns. That's your perception. And you have reason for that perception. I have reason for my perception. Again, where we're disagreeing is on the mindset. Now, what I'm looking at it is, from the McCloskeys' behavior and what they did, it told me a lot of information. And clinically, when I identify something or look at something, I have to look at what the clinical information is. They did call the police. They were saying to the protesters to move on and get out of here. In fact, I think at one point in the video, he starts pointing, like, go away, and he starts doing this with his hand, like, get out of here. He wasn't sitting here trying to be intimidating or trying to shoot. And there was no indication that they even wanted to shoot. There was an indication of, please get out of here, we're feeling threatened, we're scared. That's what I'm seeing. Now again, you can have a very different perception. And the reason why we go into court and have 12 people sit there and make a deliberation is because what they do is they start to figure this out. But if the entire thing rests on the fact that this is private property owned by them, then it's going to be very, very difficult to get past the letter of the law in that case.
That's correct, McGraw, and you hit it right on the head. The application of reasonableness depends on the totality of the circumstances. So did the individual who tragically killed this young man, did that individual reasonably believe that he needed to use that force to defend himself? And did he reasonably believe that the young man was about to engage in unlawful conduct or unlawful entry onto his property?
All right, now, since you like to do this to your students, I'm going to do this to you. Let's change some of the facts here. Let's argue, Greg Willard, that it wasn't in his backyard. The city of St. Louis, when I lived there, I parked on the street in front of my house. If I woke up at midnight on a Saturday night and saw 3 people rummaging through my car in the public street in front of my house in my private car, do I have that same protection as this landowner?
No.
And there is the key. And I think this is one of the issues that reason why you wrote what you wrote and why it made a lot of sense is that you're looking at it from the standpoint of being outside their home. But the law is very clear that that community, which was private property and was not public to the streets, does not have the same law.
You do not. And the distinction is this. There are 2 separate portions of the statute. Since the car is on the street, it is not on your private property. And therefore, that piece of the Castle Doctrine does not apply. If you were in the car, there's a separate part of the statute that gives you protection. If you were occupying the car, the statute says, McGraw, then you could use deadly force to protect yourself if you reasonably believe that was necessary.
Even if my car is my private property on public land?
Correct.
So the depending if it's on public property or private property, changes this in the law. Now, do I think that's great? No. It sets up a lot of people to go ahead and be attorneys and having to figure these types of things out, which is why I always say dealing with the law is a very difficult thing. And it's a horrible thing because it puts a lot of people under a lot of situations they don't even know. If you're in one state, you're doing the right thing. If you're in a different state, you're now a felon and you're going to be in long-term jail. To me, something's wrong with that. That you shouldn't be able to be, well, if I'm 10 feet this way over the state line, then the behavior I did is absolutely legal. And if I move 10 feet this way, I'm now a felon that belongs in jail. Something is wrong with that. But this is what we have, and this is the situation that we have in this country. And whether you agree or disagree, this was the law at the time when this situation happened. And that's why the bias in the way of looking at the situation creates the idea of whether or not a prosecutor will bring charges or not, which then makes this the reason why, depending on who's looking at it and whose bias is happening, you're going to see horrible things that go in law system. Because the more biased that a person is, and the more they have their agenda and basically can't see things from an objective standpoint, but only subjectively, you're going to make much more decisions based upon your own biases and less about the idea of understanding the reasonableness of the situation. Because if it's about the reasonableness, then it's only as reasonable as I am. So if I'm an unreasonable person and I'm making those decisions, then what's the effect going to be?
I don't think with your car out on the street, if you're not occupying it, I do not think in Missouri you could use the Castle Doctrine as a defense if you shoot someone from your home who is on the car out in the public street.
Yeah.
Again, it's different if you're occupying it.
Right.
But I think that if you if you were to shoot that person in your car out on the street, I think you would be in criminal jeopardy.
Greg Willard, from all you're saying, it sounds to me like this shooting, as sad as it was and as terrible as it is that this young teenager lost his life, that this 60-year-old homeowner was justified in his actions under the law.
Well, I won't go that far, McGraw, because I think we all need to know a little bit more facts as to what his state of mind was, and the question as to whether he reasonably believed that the force that he used was, quote, necessary to defend himself.
I love that. And this is why I love attorneys. Because I want you to think we have to be able to look at whether he believed. How are you going to do that? Well, I'm going to ask him. And he's going to say, yes, I believed I was. So it's a very funny kind of nature that you're looking at here, is what the person's reasonable belief is. And when you write up standards like this, it creates tremendous problems and opens up the door for huge discrepancy to happen in cases. Because the jury is then going to hear the person make their statement, and then it goes based upon whether or not you believe them or not. And again, this is where biases come in.
What I think we need to take a step back and recognize is the circuit attorney has a very difficult task in front of her and her assistants down there. And I'm sure they're looking at it carefully. But at the end of the day, let's not lose sight of this simple fact. The Missouri legislature has enacted laws expanding the scope of citizens' rights to use deadly force. Now, whether you or I agree with that as a policy matter, well, we can go to the ballot box and express that. But I think it's important that we not shine a spotlight critically or otherwise on the circuit attorney's office, because this is a very, very difficult statute. It is.
Just to give a light to what I'm hearing from the attorney, I don't agree with this. I think this is horrible, and I think we should go to the ballot box to fight against it. But ultimately, the statute's written in a way that's going to allow this man to do what he did. And even though I morally disagree with it, he's going to be going down for the crime. I mean, he's going to be not going down for a crime that this attorney thinks that should not have been the case. The law did not only not get changed, it's been reaffirmed. And the nature of the McCloskeys actually shooting at the protesters might have even fell in exactly into the doctrine. But they didn't do that. They pointed their weapon. And if they had the right, or to make the case they had the right to legally shoot, then by pointing to stop that violence, then for sure that would be the case to fall under the doctrine. And that's why so many people are coming out and saying what is going on here. Because this is why these laws were created, for people to be protected in their homes and on their property.
Particularly expansive in the state of Missouri as compared to some other states. And it simply adds, unfortunately, to the horrific tragedy that our community has suffered with this young man's death.
Greg Willard, great job as always, KTRS legal analyst.
And the truth is, like I said, he did a really excellent job of explaining it despite his own personal views. And he definitely has them, and that's quite all right. And that's what I love about our country, is that there are people out there, despite their own feelings and biases, that can still give you the facts. They can still tell you what the rules are given a situation. He does not like the outcome. There are other people who would say they don't like the fact that somebody could be going through their stuff, making them fear for their life, that they shouldn't have to run away or be afraid to be shot before shooting first. So the law was created to allow people to protect their property. Now again, you could disagree. In the state I live in, there is not a stand your ground law. There is no aspect that you're allowed to be able to do any of this stuff. So in my state, all of this stuff would be totally illegal. But in the state of Missouri, given the facts of what they're allowed to do, and given where they were, I think it's very hard-pressed to say that they violated the law, given what the law allows them to do.
Protesters outside their Central West End home have now been charged. Good evening, I'm Mike Bush. And I'm Ann Allred. Mark and Patricia McCloskeys have been defending themselves in the court of public opinion since last month's encounter. Now,
just to look just quickly here in this one picture, and you see it. You see her eyes and what she's doing. She's actually speaking to somebody in this face, as well as looking at a specific individual. This is what this picture captures, and in the video you actually see this picture. It's part of the video.
Now they'll have to defend themselves in criminal court. Tonight, the Missouri Attorney General...
Now again, look at the hand and where it's pointing at. And what is he saying? It's get, go. So the idea is that the McCloskeys are saying to the people, stay away, get out of here. They're not saying, we don't like you, we hate you, this is it. They're saying to them because they seem to be afraid. Now these are images that I didn't choose. The news center chose. And I think it really does speak to their state of mind.
General is stepping in to help them. Jenna Barnes has the new developments.
Now you saw in that last picture, she was now looking in a different direction, yelling at somebody else. Again, why is the switch to moving back and forth? If it was one person that she was having the issue with, it's the protesters. It's one person, then another person, then another person. And she's saying, stay away, stay back. It's if you've ever seen the movie Aliens, when Hudson is basically shooting one, you want more from me, you want more from me, and one. It's like he's going from one to one. And then sadly, the one comes from the ceiling and takes him out. But the nature by what he was dealing with, it's looking at all the different threats coming from all different angles. And that's what you're seeing in their behavior. So if it goes to their state of mind, if I was being called in as a witness for basically giving what's called expert testimony, I would be pointing to their mannerisms and their body language and what they were saying and their fear, because you could see it in their eyes, in their face, in their structure of saying, please get away, please get out of here, trying to get the crowd to get away from them.
I'm just flat out pissed off. I mean, this has gotten to be outrageous.
Mark McCloskeys reacting on Fox News Monday night, hours after Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner charged both him and his wife Patricia with unlawful use of a weapon for pointing their guns at protesters outside their mansion last month.
And we're not going to apologize for doing what's right. We're not going to back down, and we're not going to move.
The felony charges carry a possible prison sentence of up to 4 years. But Gardner says she's open to the couple completing a diversion program through her office instead. That is, unless Missouri's Attorney General has his way. He announced he's trying to get the case dismissed.
Enough is enough. As Missouri's chief law enforcement officer, I simply will not stand by while Missouri law is being ignored.
He's referring to the Castle Doctrine, which in Missouri allows people to defend not only their homes, but their property. A St. Louis University constitutional and criminal law professor says the private street where the McCloskeys live is covered.
There was no right to protest on their street. The protesters were actually trespassing on private property.
He says the couple has a defense if the charges stick.
All they have to show is they had a reasonable fear of force.
The case.
And I think that this is where it comes down to, and this is why I think that you necessarily maybe didn't understand the nature of this is a private property, that the Castle Doctrine covers that street area, and then that other law that you were referring to doesn't even apply in this area. They have a right on their property to display, if they feel there's any sort of threat, that they're allowed to defend themselves. And again, I think it falls under that they absolutely have the ability to show that.
Has garnered national political attention. The McCloskeys appearing at a virtual Trump campaign event.
This is a continuation of that law and order idea that, folks have to protect themselves from lawlessness.
But political analyst Anita Mannion says that could help Gardner in her primary fight next month.
Saying she won't be bullied by President Trump, Governor Parson, Senator Hawley is not a bad thing when you're running in a Democratic primary.
Jenna Barnes, 5 on your side.
Now that is absolutely the part that kills me the most with all of that, because at the end it comes down to politics. And these two people who suffered in terms of the fear that they had that day, they didn't think a protest was coming into their gated community and had no clue what was going to go on. They obviously do not know how to use the weapons that they own. and they didn't fire them. They were trying to keep them at bay and keep people away, protecting themselves and their household. And like I said, given the law, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to actually prosecute them. And I think that this is very much a political prosecution. And it's sad because it goes against what we would like in this society. We would like justice for all. And I really would love to see justice for all. And I know there are many other cases where there is no justice. Believe me, I know. But I really would love to see that we get towards more justice, not less justice. I hope that you like this video. And again, I thank you so much for your well thought out and really strong argument. So I very much appreciated it. Plus, it forced me to delve a little bit deeper into the statute that you pointed me to. And even though I'm not an attorney and glad that I did not become one, it was still a very interesting and enlightening experience. So I thank you for that. And again, if you like this video, hit like. If you disagree with anything I said, please tell me with the comments below. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do. And share this with others to give them the ability to have an idea, to learn different things, and a different way of approaching things. Sometimes just have the ability to agree to disagree, which is a very important skill that we in this country need to learn now more than ever. I wish you have a good night and good mental health.